Us. We are live from AccuWeather headquarters. I'm meteorologist Julia Wyden, and we are continuing our AccuWeather series about hurricane preparedness. Today, we are talking to Tom Bedard. He's a meteorologist over in our Wichita office, and we're talking to him about what to do when it comes to evacuating or maybe deciding to stay in the situation of a hurricane. Hi, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here, Julia.
So we want to get right to it. We want to talk about making that decision, about maybe deciding that it's time to pack up to get out of the way of a hurricane, or in some cases, some folks do decide to stay behind in the situation of a hurricane. How do you make that decision? What goes into it, and how do you prepare for it?
It's such an individual decision that every family has to make. You are sitting on the coastline, there's a hurricane forming off the Cape Verde Islands, and you have to figure out whether or not this is something that you're going to stay and try to ride out, or get the heck out of the way of and go to family in Ohio, Illinois, somewhere where you don't have a tropical coastline. Above all else, when local emergency management and public safety says mandatory evacuation, get out of there. They know what they're talking about, and you may be in a specific hazard zone. So that should be said outright, is that if you're ever instructed by public safety to evacuate, then make sure you are well out of the area. Beyond that, get a feel for what's going on in your neighborhood. Think about the last time that you flooded. What happened? How much rain did it take to create that flooding in the local area? Because as you have that hurricane, tropical storm, tropical depression, really any of them can cause a deadly environment. You need to be really aware of how that's going to impact where you are. One of the biggest misconceptions with tropical cyclones is that the lower tier ones, that category 1 and category 2, really aren't that deadly and aren't that dangerous. I mean, it's a scale that goes all the way up to 5. Why be concerned about the small ones? Tropical Storm Allison in Houston in 2001 was their wettest storm before Harvey this past year. So never look at a hurricane forecast and think just because it's a tropical storm, you don't need to think about this conversation. So as I'm mentioning categories and tropical storms versus hurricanes versus depressions, people should know that you need to get your forecast information from a reputable source. Now, whether that is AccuWeather, or you go to another big vendor, or you're looking at the National Hurricane Center. Everybody should be aware that you are finding a good source for weather. And the reason that I say this is there are some ridiculously bad sources out there. My background is in firefighting and emergency medical services. So whenever there's a big storm on the horizon, our chiefs and our captains are always exchanging what the forecast is going to be. If it's from a weather blog and you read into it and it says, this is so-and-so engineer, I don't have a background in meteorology, don't read that. Don't take it into account. Always stick with one of the bigger agencies like AccuWeather or with the National Hurricane Center to make sure you've got the right source out there. So above all else, know what happens in your area, know when you flood, take a look around your neighborhood and see if there would be a lot of debris that would arise if you had a wind gust. Say if you had 75 to 100 mile an hour winds, you may not want to stick around if there is a lot of lawn furniture, grills, or propane tanks in the neighborhood you think might not get taken inside. You have to do a personal risk assessment, and that doesn't have to be in advance. Just think about the worst case scenario, and if that happened, if it flooded, if the storm intensified, how would you feel that? And if you don't feel safe, get out of there, evacuate, and come back home afterwards.
And I just want to remind everyone at home that if you have any questions for Tom or for me, this is your time that you can write them on into the comments section, and we'll go ahead and try to answer some of your questions. Folks who live in coastal areas, again, this is your opportunity to maybe ask something that's been on your mind. Tom, something that you mentioned there was about flooding, and a suggestion that we have had for folks at home is to really know your topography also. I think that's so important because not only will it tell you if you're in a flood zone, it will also tell you where you can go to get to higher ground, to get to a safer spot. Tom, I want to go back to what you were talking about with regards to getting that forecast information. You mentioned that you should, of course, turn to some bigger agencies like the National Weather Service or, of course, like AccuWeather. We would love it if you checked out our website or our app during those times of need. What are some ways that people can get that information, maybe in the time when the power is out?
Oh, that is a great question. One of the best assumptions you can make with a tropical cyclone, storm, or hurricane is that you're going to lose power, and you may very well lose cell reception too. That's something that we always discuss in a disaster environment. Take your normal means of communications and throw them out the window. That is why FEMA, the National Weather Service, and AccuWeather always recommends having one of those NOAA weather radios. That NOAA weather radio network takes a lot of damage to go down, and it is a very reliable source of getting information. Where day in and day out, it may not be turned on in your office, your bedroom, or your kitchen. We always recommend having that inside of your disaster kit so that when the cell phone towers go down, if they go down, and when you lose power, you've at least got some fail-safe to make sure you've got that weather information. Now, if no weather radio goes down, we may recommend carrier pigeons or smoke signals, but by all else, have a weather radio and be ready to get information that way.
Those weather radios are so fantastic to have. I used to work down in the deep south, and they sell them at the grocery store. You can go on into any electronics store and buy them. They're great because they do plug in, so most of the time when your electricity is working just fine, so will your weather radio. But if the electricity does go out, there are backup batteries in there, so they'll just kick right on in. Okay, I want to talk to you a little bit more about what happens if you decide to stay in your home. What are some important things that people need to know with regards to when they could potentially get help?
Right, and that's a great question to ask. There are a spectrum of storms that could cause any number of impacts you might feel. So starting off, at least in the best case scenario, you should expect a lot of heavy rain, a lot of wind, flooding. And as soon as you see flooding, make sure you stay far away from those floodwaters. I know that this is something as meteorologists we preach all too much, but floodwaters contain some of the most noxious, vile chemicals that you can imagine. You've got poisonous animals, insects, debris, and floodwaters moving 10 miles an hour would have the same amount of force as a 270-mile-an-hour wind. Floodwaters are dirty and they're dangerous. Stay out of them. And that's in the best case if you just get rain and not a lot of wind. But as soon as you start talking about tropical storm force winds and greater, be aware that first responders, including myself, may not be allowed to respond to you, even if you call 911 with the worst emergency. We will always try to make our best effort, but our apparatus, whether that is a fire engine or an ambulance, only have certain thresholds that they can go outside in. If you've got strong Category 1 hurricane winds, or if you've got a lot of flooding, we may not be able to reach you. So stay in contact with your local emergency management and see when they're going to be cutting off service. Because with big storms like Sandy, you heard from public officials that there is a point where first responders will not come and get you. That would be a risk to our lives and yours as well. If you're caught in that situation, if you are in an emergency, you're having a medical emergency, or you're in your house and it's flooding, try to survive as best as can and try to get your message out to local 911 centers, again, as best as can. If there's a cell network out there that's still open, tweet at the local 911 center, tweet at emergency management, get your message out there, or pass it along to someone else. Just be aware that if you stay, there is a high likelihood that in bad storms, EMTs, firefighters, and paramedics and police will not be able to get to you. That is not all storms, and all first responders will make their best effort to get to you if you're in need. But in some particularly bad events, we may not be a resource until those winds die down.
Something that you mentioned was just trying to stay alive, staying in a survival situation where you might have water coming on into your home. We talked about this a little bit last week with extreme meteorologist Reed Timmer, and he gave some really interesting advice. He said that if you're in your home and it starts to take on water, you obviously want to get higher up and higher up, go up levels as much as you can until you get to the attic. You never want to go into your attic during a flooding situation, because if your attic takes on water, you could actually drown in your attic. It's a really scary thought. Instead, you should try to get onto your roof at that point. And if you're on your roof, you're obviously exposing yourself to all of the elements of the storm. Do you have any advice for people at home who might find themselves in that type of a situation?
I hope that nobody needs to find themselves in that situation anymore in the future, but I know this came up during Hurricane Harvey last year. If you find yourselves stuck on a roof because your house is flooding and you've stayed during a particularly bad storm, be as cognizant as possible. And if you have a battery-powered emergency radio with a NOAA weather radio in it, Be as cognizant as possible of tornado warnings. Every landfalling tropical system has the potential of producing tornadoes. Now, by and far, they're not as strong as the ones that we feel here in Kansas during the spring or they feel in Oklahoma. They tend to, on average, be around EF0 being EF2. So that is, while not the media capturing large tornadoes you may see in Oklahoma, they're still ones that are entirely deadly if you are sitting on your roof as it approaches. So be aware that you may need to transition shelter. And that's why we really encourage people just to get out of the area when you see a strong tropical storm or a strong hurricane approaching, because you'll be caught running between shelter from flooding to shelter to tornadoes. And it's something that, to be quite honest, we don't have a best practice of quite yet. It was a significant issue during Harvey, and it will continue to be one until either we convince everybody to evacuate during storms or we come up with an engineering capability to be able to get people to shelter both from floodwaters and from hurricanes. We certainly don't want to put people in that situation. So remember, every landfalling tropical cyclone produces, or at least has the capability of producing tornadoes. And that's something that you have to be aware of if you're in a neighborhood that floods and if you think that you would like to stay.
I want to ask you a little bit about some special populations, because not everyone is able-bodied and able to evacuate so quickly or gather all their supplies, especially when it comes to folks who are elderly. What specific advice do you have for people who are above a certain age who are in an area that may need to evacuate?
That's a great question. Thank you. Those with functional and access needs, whether that is additional assistance getting around your house or you are a senior citizen, if you need assistance evacuating, reach out to your local emergency management agency ahead of the storm. At the beginning of hurricane season, or where we are right now, with no hurricanes present in the Atlantic, at least I hope, knock on wood, I have not checked the tropical weather outlook this morning, not doing due diligence on my end. If you know that you're going to need assistance in evacuating, talk to your emergency management agency and see what provisions they've made available to you. Oftentimes, it may be assistance through the Red Cross, but this is something that you should be aware of before there's any risk of a landfalling storm at all. And I say that because when we see a risk coming within the next 3 to 5 days of a tropical event, whether that's a hurricane or a storm, emergency management agencies and the Red Cross become very busy. And so get as much information as necessary before the event. If you are a home health care provider, or if you are taking care of your parents or a family member with functional and access needs, do this research for them before the event. Have that written down in your emergency plan and know that you can act on it when that forecast calls for a storm. So don't wait until the last second to find out, but know that those services are there and available for you.
And I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about pets too, because pets, of course, are furry family members. We want to make sure that they are staying safe during storms as well. Is there anything special that you can think of that we should be doing to prepare for keeping our cats and our dogs and any other kind of animals safe during a storm?
Absolutely. When you look at shelter maps, and they may be offered through the Red Cross, local emergency management, United Way, whatever non-governmental organization may be hosting, there will be certain shelters that will identify themselves as pet friendly, where you'd be able to bring your pet. If you have exotic animals, please be cognizant that you may need additional accommodations in that shelter, and to consider evacuating ahead of the storm so you don't need to use those sheltering accommodations. But when disasters occur, there are oftentimes a lot of very interesting pet choices that make their way to shelters. So make sure you know what pet-approved shelters are out there. Now, if you have a service animal, those are able to be brought into any shelter, of course, so that goes without saying. But please make sure that when you are planning for a hurricane, take your pet safety in mind. They are members of your family. And when you evacuate, please do not leave them behind. Bring them with you.
Really good advice. All right, I just want to ask you one last question, Tom. This is about the aftermath of a storm. So much we're focused on preparing for the storm, making sure we're safe during it, but sometimes you can still face weather-related risks even after the storm is over and the weather seems totally clear. What types of things do you need to prepare for?
The period of recovery after a hurricane can be as dangerous as the period during the storm. extreme heat following a hurricane, when you have that high humidity, your body's not going to be able to cool itself as easy. So remain aware of heat stress. You may also have severe weather conditions following that hurricane as well. You could have a cold front coming through that has severe thunderstorms, tornadoes. Anything is really possible meteorologically after a hurricane. But as you traverse outside and you're trying to rebuild, recover, take things that were dispersed out of your house, be very aware of live utility poles and electrical lines, of potential gas leaks. So please do not use candles. Do not use any flame at all. And wear as much protective clothing as possible. Wear long sleeves, long pants, and a hat. Use bug spray. Use sunscreen because the sun will be out. Mosquitoes will sure be in force. And there may be a lot of debris out, like nails or other shards of glass or wood. It's a really hazardous environment to be in. So as you're getting your kit ready and your go bag, put a good pair of thick pants, a good long sleeve shirt, some shoes, ideally with some safety toes and some very thick soles, a hat, and sunglasses. Now, this should be present in your kit at all times for all hazards anyway, because whether it is a severe thunderstorm, a tornado, a hurricane, or an ice storm, all of these risks exist during the recovery phase of a disaster, and you should be prepared to care for yourself accordingly.
Tom, thank you so much. You are a wealth of knowledge in this area. We really appreciate you answering all of our questions for us today. Everyone at home, thank you so much for joining us, and be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 1 o'clock. We'll be speaking to Matt Little from FEMA about how to make recovering from a hurricane a little bit easier. We'll see you then.